The first toast at my brother's wedding wasn't meant to celebrate the bride and groom. It was meant to embarrass me. My father stood beneath a crystal chandelier, lifted his champagne glass, and smiled proudly at a room filled with friends, relatives, and business associates. Then he looked straight at me. "I've always believed family comes first," he announced. "That's why we've continued helping our youngest son financially while he figures life out." The room responded with polite applause. A few guests glanced in my direction with sympathetic smiles. Someone near the back whispered, "Poor kid." My brother couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. My mother nodded with quiet satisfaction, convinced the speech had gone exactly as planned. They all believed they had reminded everyone who held the power. What none of them knew was that every word my father had just spoken belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I hadn't depended on anyone for almost a year. I owned my apartment. I loved my career. And the person they still imagined struggling had quietly built a life they knew nothing about. When my father finished speaking, he extended the microphone toward me. He expected gratitude. Instead, he unknowingly handed me the opportunity to tell the only story that mattered. But before I said a single word, my mind drifted back to the years that had brought us to that moment. Growing up, my older brother Daniel could do almost anything without facing consequences. If he forgot an assignment, the teacher was unfair. If he lost a job, the manager didn't appreciate him. If he made an expensive mistake, my parents always found a way to fix it. There was always another excuse. Always another chance. Always another safety net. I wasn't given the same luxury. When I wanted something, I earned it. If I needed new textbooks, I worked weekends. If I wanted to attend a school trip, I saved every spare dollar for months. My parents never called it favoritism. They called it fairness. "Your brother needs a little more help," my mother often said. Eventually, I stopped arguing. Some battles only leave you exhausted. So instead of competing for attention, I focused on building a future no one could take away. High school became my escape. While Daniel spent most evenings with friends, I buried myself in books. Scholarships became my goal. Not because I loved studying. Because I understood something early in life. Every scholarship I earned was another piece of freedom. That strategy paid off. By the time I entered college, most of my tuition was covered through academic awards, grants, and a part-time research position. The small amount my parents contributed always came with reminders. "We've sacrificed a lot for you. You should appreciate everything we've done." I thank them every time. What I never mentioned was that their contribution covered far less than they believed. I preferred peace over arguments. After graduation, another opportunity appeared almost by accident. A professor recommended me for a junior analyst position at a rapidly growing technology company. The interview lasted less than an hour. 2 days later, I received an offer. It wasn't glamorous. The office was small. The hours were long. But every project taught me something new. Within months, promotions followed. Then performance bonuses. Then leadership responsibilities. My income grew faster than I ever expected. The first thing I did wasn't buying an expensive car. It wasn't taking luxury vacations. I paid off every remaining student expense. Then I signed the paperwork for a modest apartment across town. For the first time in my life, every bill carried only one name. Mine. Oddly enough, my family never noticed. Not because I kept it secret. Because nobody ever asked. Every phone call eventually became another conversation about Daniel. His promotion. His engagement. His wedding plans. His guest list. His honeymoon. It was as though the rest of us had become supporting characters in someone else's story. Then came the engagement announcement. Within days, my parents transformed into full-time wedding planners. Weekends disappeared into venue tours. Family dinners became planning meetings. Holiday gatherings turned into budget discussions. Every conversation revolved around floral arrangements, seating charts, photographers, or menu tastings. My own life barely entered the discussion. Whenever work prevented me from attending another planning event, disappointment quickly followed. "You really should make more of an effort," my mother would say. "Your brother only gets married once." I always apologized. Not because I believed I was wrong, because explaining myself never changed anything. 3 weeks before the wedding, my father called. His voice carried the same authority I'd heard my entire life. "You've missed another rehearsal dinner." I had work. "You always have work lately." There was a brief silence. Then came the sentence he clearly believed would settle everything. "If you can't start putting this family first, maybe we should reconsider continuing to support you financially." Years ago, that threat would have terrified me. This time, I almost smiled. Because while my father believed he was holding my future in his hands, he had no idea I'd already built one of my own. The conversation ended with my father sounding completely satisfied. He thought the warning had worked. He believed I'd finally accepted my place. I simply set my phone down, returned to work, and let him keep believing it. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves when you don't argue. Over the next 2 weeks, the wedding consumed my family's lives. Group messages arrived every day. One was about seating arrangements. The next asked for volunteers to decorate the reception hall. Another reminded everyone about rehearsal schedules, dress fittings, airport pickups, and welcome dinners. Every task somehow became urgent. Every request somehow became my responsibility. Daniel rarely asked directly. Instead, my parents did it for him. "Can you pick up Aunt Linda from the airport? Would you mind helping the photographer after the ceremony? The wedding coordinator needs another pair of hands." None of those requests were unreasonable on their own. It was the expectation behind them. No one asked whether I was available. They simply assumed I would rearrange my life. Despite everything, I agreed. Every single time. My sudden cooperation caught everyone off guard. My mother sounded almost cheerful whenever we spoke. "I'm glad you're finally making an effort." "So am I replied. My father even joked during one phone call. "I knew you'd come to your senses." I smiled to myself after hanging up. If believing that made him happy, I wasn't going to correct him. The truth had a way of arriving on its own. Meanwhile, work continued moving faster than ever. The company had recently signed a major client, and our team was handling projects that only months earlier would have seemed impossible. Most evenings stretched well past dinner. I didn't mind. For the first time in my life, every long hour was building something that belonged entirely to me. One Friday afternoon, my manager called me into his office. He closed the door, smiled, and slid a folder across the desk. "We're creating a new leadership position," he said. "I want you to take it." For a second, I thought he was joking. Then he showed me the contract. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, annual bonuses, stock options, and the chance to lead my own department. I accepted before he finished explaining the details. Walking back to my desk, I couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't just about the money. It was proof that every late night, every sacrifice, and every lonely weekend had meant something. That evening I considered calling my parents. For a brief moment, I imagined sharing the news. Maybe this time they'd ask questions. Maybe they'd finally want to know how work was going. Instead, my phone rang first. It was my mother. For nearly 20 minutes she talked excitedly about centerpieces, guest favors, and the color of the table linens. Not once did she ask what I'd been doing. By the time the conversation ended, my promotion had never come up. I quietly put my phone away. Some disappointments eventually stop hurting. They simply confirm what you've known all along. 2 days before the wedding, an email arrived from the event planner. Attached was the complete reception itinerary. I opened it between meetings, expecting nothing more than a timeline for dinner and dancing. Instead, one page immediately caught my attention. There was an entire section titled Family Tributes. The maid of honor would speak first. Then the best man. After that came my mother's speech. My father would follow. Finally, my name. I frowned. No one had asked whether I wanted to give a speech. No one had discussed what I planned to say. They had simply printed my name into the program as though my role had already been decided. Curious, I scrolled through the remaining pages. At the bottom was a short note from the planner. Following Mr. Carter's remarks, Ethan will offer a few words thanking the family for their love and support before inviting guests to raise a final toast. I read the sentence twice. So that was the plan. They weren't just expecting me to speak. They had already decided what my speech was supposed to accomplish. In their minds, I would stand in front of 200 guests, thank my parents for everything they'd done, praise my brother, and reinforce the image they had spent years creating. An image where Daniel was the family's greatest success. And I was still finding my way. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For the first time since the engagement, everything finally made sense. The speeches. The pressure. The sudden insistence that I attend every event. The financial threats. None of it had been about helping the wedding. It had been about protecting a story. A story where my parents remained the generous providers. A story where Daniel stood as the family's shining example. A story where I remained the younger son who still depended on everyone else. The only problem was, that story hadn't been true for a very long time. And in less than 48 hours, everyone in that ballroom was going to discover just how outdated it really was. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. The country club buzzed with music, photographers, and guests dressed in their finest. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Servers hurried between tables making last-minute adjustments. Everything looked exactly the way my mother had imagined it for months. As soon as I walked inside, I noticed the atmosphere. My parents weren't simply excited. They were confident. The kind of confidence that comes from believing everything is under control. My mother greeted relatives as if she were hosting the event herself. My father moved through the ballroom shaking hands and accepting compliments about the wedding. Daniel looked completely relaxed. Every detail had fallen into place. Or so they believed. When my father spotted me, he smiled and gave me a firm pat on the shoulder. "I'm glad you decided to be part of today." "I wouldn't have missed it," I answered. He nodded with obvious satisfaction. "I knew we could count on you." I smiled politely. He walked away before noticing the meaning behind my expression. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel and his bride exchanged heartfelt vows. Their families applauded. Friends wiped away tears. For a while, it felt like every other wedding I'd ever attended. I genuinely hoped they would have a happy marriage. None of what had happened between my parents and me had anything to do with the woman Daniel had chosen to marry. She had always treated me kindly. She simply hadn't seen what happened behind closed doors. After the ceremony, guests gathered for cocktails before moving into the reception hall. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Soft music filled the room while servers delivered dinner. Conversation and laughter echoed from every table. Eventually, the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and announced it was time for the evening speeches. The maid of honor spoke first. She shared funny stories from college. The room laughed. The best man followed with stories about growing up alongside Daniel. His speech earned another round of applause. Then my mother stepped onto the stage. She spoke lovingly about Daniel's childhood. She thanked friends and relatives for supporting the couple. For several minutes, everything sounded perfectly normal. Gradually, however, her speech changed direction. She began talking about sacrifice. About the challenges parents face while raising children. About the financial and emotional support families provide throughout life. She proudly explained how much she and my father had invested in giving their children every possible opportunity. Most guests smiled warmly. They saw devoted parents celebrating their family. I recognized something else. She was preparing the foundation for what came next. When she finished, my father accepted the microphone. Unlike my mother, he didn't bother easing into the point. He praised Daniel as someone who had embraced responsibility from an early age. He described him as dependable, hardworking, and ready to build a successful future. Then his attention shifted. "There comes a time," he said, "when every young person has to grow into adulthood." His eyes found mine. Some get there sooner than others. A few quiet laughs drifted through the ballroom. He continued speaking as though he were offering fatherly wisdom instead of public criticism. We never stop helping our children. We support them financially. We guide them when they lose direction. We do whatever it takes because that's what family does. Several guests nodded in agreement. Then came the line he clearly believed would earn the loudest applause. I'm proud to say we've continued supporting our youngest son while he gets himself established. The room responded exactly as he expected. People clapped. Some turned toward me with sympathetic smiles. Others whispered to one another. They had accepted the picture he painted without question. Across the head table, Daniel looked almost amused. My mother folded her hands with quiet satisfaction. Everything was unfolding exactly according to their plan. Then my father smiled warmly and stretched out his arm. And now, he said, I'd like my youngest son to say a few words. The ballroom applauded again as I stood. I walked calmly toward the stage. Every step seemed louder than the last. When I accepted the microphone, the applause slowly faded. More than 200 people waited for me to speak. My father stepped aside with the expression of a man expecting gratitude. My mother looked proud. Daniel leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. I looked around the room. Then I smiled. First, I began, I'd like to congratulate Daniel and Sophie. They've planned an incredible day, and I truly wish them a lifetime of happiness together. The guests responded with warm applause. Daniel smiled politely. So before anything else, I continued, thank you for allowing me to be part of such an important moment. Everything still felt perfectly normal. Exactly the way my parents expected. Then I paused. There was just enough silence for every conversation in the ballroom to disappear. I also want to thank my parents, I said. They've always believed in helping family. My father nodded proudly. My mother smiled. Neither of them realized that the next sentence would change the entire evening. I was especially surprised to hear that they're still supporting me financially. The smiles around the room became uncertain. A few guests laughed softly, unsure whether I'd made a joke. I looked toward my parents before calmly adding, mostly because they haven't needed to support me for quite some time. The ballroom fell completely silent. No one moved. For a few long seconds, the only sound in the ballroom was the soft music still drifting through the speakers. My father's smile faded. My mother stared at me as if she hadn't heard correctly. Daniel shifted in his chair, suddenly paying much closer attention. I kept my voice calm. There seems to have been a misunderstanding tonight. I glanced around the room before continuing. I've actually been financially independent for almost a year. Several guests exchanged confused looks. I completed my degree early last year, I said. A few weeks later, I accepted a full-time position with a technology firm. Since then, I've been supporting myself completely. A murmur spread across the tables. People weren't reacting because I'd become successful. They were reacting because the story they'd just been told no longer made sense. My parents probably didn't know that, I continued. Not because I kept it a secret, but because we haven't talked much about my life lately. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody applauded. They simply listened. I've been fortunate, I said. My career has grown faster than I expected. Earlier this week, I accepted a promotion that I'm incredibly proud of. I smiled. It wasn't something I planned to announce today. This wedding should be about Daniel and Sophie. I turned toward the newlyweds. And I sincerely hope you both have a wonderful life together. Sophie's expression softened. She gave me a small nod, as though she understood there was far more history behind this moment than she'd ever realized. I looked back toward the guests. The only reason I felt I needed to speak is because I don't want anyone leaving tonight believing something that simply isn't true. I lowered the microphone slightly. My parents have helped me at different times in my life, and I'll always appreciate that. I paused. But there's a difference between gratitude and pretending I still depend on people when I don't. The room remained completely still. Then an older gentleman seated near the front raised his hand with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry," he said, "but can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If you've been working for almost a year, did your parents celebrate your graduation?" The question wasn't hostile. It sounded genuinely curious. I looked toward my parents. Neither of them answered. After several seconds, I quietly replied, "No." Another silence followed. They were meeting with wedding vendors that weekend. No one said a word. No explanation was necessary. Every person in that ballroom understood exactly what those few words meant. My father finally stepped forward. "Today isn't the time for this," he said, forcing a tight smile. "You're right," I answered. "It never should have been." I handed him the microphone. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I only wanted to correct the record. Then I turned back toward Daniel and Sophie. "I truly wish you both every happiness." They thanked me quietly. Without another word, I walked away from the stage. The ballroom remained unusually quiet as I returned to my seat. Conversations resumed only in whispers. The celebration continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The carefully crafted image my parents had spent years protecting had disappeared in less than 5 minutes. A short while later, I slipped out before the dancing began. Outside, the evening air felt cooler than I remembered. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Not because I had won. There hadn't been a winner. There had only been the truth. Over the following months, life moved forward. Work continued to challenge me. The promotion opened new opportunities, and eventually I found myself leading projects I once believed were far beyond my experience. The confidence I gained wasn't measured by my paycheck. It came from realizing I no longer needed anyone else's approval to believe in myself. Several weeks after the wedding, my mother called. The conversation was different from every one we'd had before. For the first time, she asked about my work. She asked about my apartment. She asked how I had been. Whether guilt inspired those questions or genuine curiosity, I couldn't say. But I answered honestly. My father reached out not long afterward. Neither of us pretended the wedding hadn't happened. Instead of arguing, we talked. Really talked. For the first time in years, our conversation wasn't built around expectations or obligations. It was simply two adults speaking to one another. Things didn't become perfect overnight. Families rarely work that way. Old habits take time to change. Some never do. But I learned something far more valuable than proving anyone wrong. Real independence isn't measured by the money you earn. It's measured by the moment someone else loses the power to define your worth. For years, I believed I needed my family's approval to feel successful. Standing in that ballroom, I finally understood I never had. Sometimes the people who underestimate you aren't trying to hold you back. They're simply unable to imagine how much you've grown because they stopped looking long ago. And once you stop living for their expectations, you finally have room to build the life that was always waiting for you. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong. It's reaching a place where their opinion no longer decides your worth. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew you best? I'd love to hear your experience. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next unforgettable story.